His talk today is, Why Don't Psychopaths Believe in Dualism? Please welcome Anthony.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to jump right into some questions which I think lie at the heart of why people come to this conference. So I'm just going to give you a few different questions, and if you have any comments at the end about other ones I could use, I'll be very happy to. I'm going to keep running some of these things. So here's a question. Thoughts and feelings are nothing more than the activity of neurons. Clearly relates to some positions advanced here. The mind can be understood completely by thinking of it like a very complicated computer. Maybe just want to keep track of your feeling about the answers to these. Scientists will succeed in making a robot that can experience and feel. There is life of some form or another after death. Humans have a soul. And now here's a rather more complicated one due to Sean Nichols, who's just down the road, and about free will. So imagine a universe in which everything that happens is completely caused by whatever happened before it. This is true from the very beginning of the universe. So what happened in the beginning of the universe caused what happened next, and so on, right up until the present. For example, one day John decided to have French fries at lunch, and like everything else, this decision was completely caused by what happened before. So if everything in this universe was exactly the same up until John made his decision, then it had to happen that John would decide to have French fries. Now imagine universe B, in which almost everything that happens is completely caused, but the one exception is human decision-making. So now we can consider Mary, who features in many of these stories, decided to have French fries at lunch. Since a person's decision in this universe is not completely caused by what happened before it, even if everything in the universe was exactly the same up until Mary made her decision, it did not have to happen that Mary would decide to have French fries. So you can ask yourself, where do you think our universe lies? Is it more like universe A, the completely determined universe, or more like universe B? Okay, well, these are certainly challenging questions. And I think that there's three, we can crudely characterize there are three broad positions which have been adopted within to try and address them. So one is the idea that there is a mechanism, consciousness mechanism camp, where scientists will be able to identify the neural, or perhaps not neural, but some other physical basis of these phenomena, the soul, free will, phenomenal consciousness. Another camp is the demystifying camp, which I guess Kevin partly sits in, which is that the idea that soul, free will, and phenomenal consciousness are an illusion, at least in part. That is, they may concede that they may claim there are parts that can be explained using scientific theories, other parts that can't, and that we should ignore the rest, the hard problem, or the problem of phenomenal consciousness, because it's not a properly posed question. Now, there's another position which maybe Dave adopts. I'm not quite sure if how close it would be to his, but which I think is rather nicely articulated by Stephen Jay Gould, which is an idea that the soul, free will, and phenomenal consciousness do exist, but they belong to an entirely separate realm, which science can never fully capture. And what I want to do is articulate a position like this, which is almost entirely not articulated within the scientific literature. That is, pretty much everyone either thinks there will be a mechanism or that there isn't a proper question. But I want to actually claim to you that the science suggests, if anything, that this would be the best position. So what I'm doing here is I'm offering you an account which I like to think of is in the neuroscience of philosophy. We've had a lot of philosophy of neuroscience and philosophy of psychology, and I think it's time for something a little bit new. So I'm not going to give you a scientific account of consciousness, and I'm going to point to this very rapid dismissal of all of those, but I am going to aim to give you at least a scientific account of the problem of consciousness. So how did the problem come about? So I suggest actually that this may be a larger research agenda, and certainly I think I have some friends in the XFI camp who are interested in a similar sort of approach. So the idea here is that philosophical paradoxes don't actually reflect schisms in nature, right, or in reality, but they really reveal features of the cognitive architecture that we have evolved to understand that reality. So that's the story I'm going to give you. Okay, well, obviously our cortex has expanded massively compared with many of the other animals that scientists study and use to tell us about the structure of cognition. Here you can see colored in blue is the prefrontal cortex, just a lateral view of it. We'll be talking more about the medial, the in-between surfaces in a bit. And you can see that that in particular has massively expanded. So what on earth is all this cortex doing? And it's 3 times larger, even adjusting for body size, than that of any other animal in the human. Why do we have quite so many neurons, quite so much brain? And what I want to suggest is that while cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists tend to talk mostly about processes, that really the function of all this cortex is to support extremely complex representations. We use extremely complex representations to navigate our world and to guide our interactions, right? And I want to suggest further that maybe this complexity shouldn't be understood as just being one system, but rather there are 2 centers of gravity to this system, maybe more than 2, but at least I want to talk about 2 centers of gravity to this system. Okay, so that's the idea in terms of the science I'm going to talk about. Now I'm going to switch back into philosophy, and I'm going to try and enumerate a position that I'm going to use to guide that work. So this is from Dennett, and this position is an extension of Dennett's work, right? So this is the physical stance, which is one way of trying to understand the world. From this stance, our predictions are based on the actual physical state of the particular object and are worked out by applying whatever knowledge we have of the laws of nature. Instances of prediction from the physical stance are common enough. If you turn on that switch, you'll get a nasty shock, and when the snows come, that branch will break right off. Okay, so we have the physical stance. Now, Dennett, of course, enumerated famously another stance, the intentional stance. Here's how it works. First, you decide to treat the object whose behavior is to be predicted as a rational agent. I bolded that because it may seem the first flag of a serious problem coming. Then you figure out what beliefs that agent ought to have, given its place in the world and its purpose. Then you figure out what desires it ought to have. A little practical reasoning from the chosen set of beliefs and desires will lead to a prediction about what the agent will do. So notice that both of these stances are about prediction. So there we have the intentional stance, which I've made small because it doesn't figure that much in my story. Okay, but Dennett also enumerated another stance. He hasn't said all that much about it, but he points out that one is guilty of no monstrosities if one dismembers the computer with whom one plays chess, or even the robot with whom one has long conversations. So, and then he goes on to say, maybe we need a personal stance, which is just an annexation of the intentional stance with moral commitment, right? Well, I'm not going to get into this, but there was various reasons why we were upset with this view. We didn't think it captured everything, and this is largely to do with a lot of work I did many years ago on trying to understand the nature of our experience. And Dennett has a position on that, with heterophenomenology, in which he essentially attempts to collapse descriptions of experience into information that can be gleaned from objective experiments. And I felt that this didn't quite capture what was going on, and that in fact we have 2 quite distinct ways of understanding the mental, right? A first or second person experiential perspective, and a third person in which is the viewpoint of science, where we see the self or other as an object. We focus on their behavior, their performance, and the mechanisms inside them that might give rise to them. So the idea here is, yes, we use both in everyday life, that's no problem, but the claim is, at least in scientific and philosophical context, these two forms of understanding need to be really carefully distinguished, right? And not conflated together. Right? And the claim is that many confusions arise from the failure to do that. So let me now try and give you some more Right, so now we're updating this idea of his personal stance, and now we've moved it into the phenomenal stance. So let me give you a little explanation of the phenomenal stance. So this is the stance, and this is updated from a paper written with the philosopher Philip Robbins in 2006. This is a stance we adopt when we reflect upon our own experiences and feelings, as well as the experiences and feelings of others. And it's a stance that we tend to avoid if we feel no compassion for the other, in which case we deny or dismiss their feelings. The phenomenal stance allows us to make sense of our own feelings and construct a coherent self-narrative. And entering into this stance towards another deepens our relationship with them and our sense of commitment to them, including moral commitment. This is the stance which, when it's guiding another person's interaction with us, makes us feel understood. And I want to pause particularly on that notion of understood, because I think it's one that just about anyone can grasp, that there is this concept of being understood in that way. To adopt the phenomenal stance more formally towards an object or towards X is to first of all regard it as a locus of phenomenal experience, an experiencing subject, and secondly as a target of moral concern. So those are the key claims that we're linking together in the phenomenal stance. So now we add the phenomenal stance to this picture of different types of understanding, and then the particular claim we're making is that the physical stance and the phenomenal stance are mutually exclusive. Or if you like, they are inhibitory of each other, right? So these are two forms of understanding that are disjoint. Whereas the intentional stance we see as having talk between either of these other types of understanding, right? So you can think of your computer as having goals, if it's a sophisticated computer and maybe a robot, but you may want to deny it feelings. You can certainly think of other people as having goals and beliefs that relate to their feelings, right? So the intentional stance and the interaction between the intentional and the physical stance is, of course, how Dennett attempts to explain away the problem of consciousness. We want to explain it in terms of there being a genuine inhibition between these two stances. And I'll just add that there's also, this relates to work in neuropsychology, so we see there is different disorders involved, disorders in different types of understanding. So Williams syndrome in the physical stance, Williams syndrome, people are very warm, incidentally, very socially warm and talkative. Psychopathy involving a deficit in the phenomenal stance, not so warm, but quite talkative still. And then people with autism having a failure in the intentional stance, where this is more of a problem with theory of mind. Although I would say that I think autism is a horrible grab bag of different things going on, and it's not clean from a scientific point of view in a way that psychopathy and Williams probably is more cleaner. Okay, so we're updating Dennett's map here, and here are the key points to how we're updating it. We're adding experiential understanding to this personal stance. We've got this claim that there's a direct interplay between regarding something as having phenomenal states and treating it as an object of moral concern, and that this goes both ways, right? And we're essentially now sort of making life simpler for philosophers, because instead of needing to worry about a separate problem of consciousness and free will, we're just lumping both of those together and putting it in with the naturalistic fallacy, right? That is, so now we're seeing problems about moral realism as closely related to problems of consciousness and free will. We are seeing, and we're not seeing the intentional stance as particularly critical to the tension that gives rise to this problem of consciousness. But we do regard this tension as real, as genuine. We're taking the explanatory gap very seriously. We don't see it as due to faulty reasoning. In fact, there's evidence that it is actually associated with healthy reasoning in a number of, not just in psychopathy, but in a number of different disorders, that the tension, that to have this tension between the stances is part of healthy cognition. And so we regard this as a genuine and unavoidable product of our cognitive structure. Okay, now let's just decompose this idea that there's a link between phenomenal consciousness and moral concern, and this can go two ways. One way from thinking something's conscious to treating it as an object of moral concern. I don't really want to say that much about that because I think that's so intuitive, and anyway, Jeremy Bentham said it an awfully long time ago when he said if we want to consider if we should be concerned with the welfare of creatures, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but is can they suffer? So it is, do they have the phenomenal properties, not the intentional properties? Going the other way, we made a prediction in our paper that the psychopath who doesn't treat other individuals as objects of moral concern shouldn't perceive the problem of consciousness. So let me just say a little bit more about the psychopath or the psychopathic profile, because I don't want you to have the idea that this is someone who necessarily goes out and murders people. Most people, which current science would regard as having the primary psychopathic trait of callous affect, in fact, never really commit any terrible crimes at all. Some of the other traits associated with psychopathy and Machiavellian thinking, impulsivity, and criminal tendencies are generally regarded as secondary traits by the people who are experts in this field. This tendency of callous affect, this lack of concern for others, also applies to the self. So these are very happy-go-lucky, charming, glib people. You may very much enjoy talking to them until you get in a bad situation, right? But they don't respond to negative reinforcement well or to punishment. It's thought to be due to an amygdala deficit. It's extremely heritable. So there's a recent study that shows that it's very highly genetically heritable with very little environmental influence. A huge study, very nicely done study. It's also measurable within the normal population, even that select group of normals that we call undergraduates, via self-report. And the measure I'm going to use is one that's done by the experts in the field, so Del Paulhausen, Robert Hare. So let's go back to those questions, and you can contemplate again how you answered, and then think about these things a little bit. So what I've done is I've split up each of these questions according to whether people lean towards the dualistic answer or lean towards the monistic or physicalist answer to these questions. And what we can see is that on the questions humans have a soul, clearly those who lean towards a more monistic answer score a lot higher on the callous affect scale. Similarly for there's life after death. Similarly, but not so strong, for the mind is like a computer. Well, there will be conscious robots is the only one that wasn't significant in itself. Feelings are just neural activity is pretty good. Gangbusters is humans' decisions are determined. Now, if you can't correlate within this sample because they're not normal. I'm not going to bore you with things like this, but all those questions cohere quite well, which is a measure called Cronbach's alpha. And then when you look at the correlation with callous affect between all of these things glommed together, you get a reasonable negative correlation. We saw R minus 0.3, and similarly for non-parametric. Okay, so when you hear things like this, I imagine that the mind immediately goes to something, to salacious, gossipy type thoughts. And obviously I realize this is the only reason I'm in a plenary session is because it makes Dave look good. But I really don't want you to go there, actually, because note that the correlation is fairly modest, right? And I think that when it comes to people who are really thinking about intellectual concerns that are pushing them one way or another, I think that's a different matter. This is in a normal population who are essentially philosophically naive. And, I think I'd rather keep my studies in that population for now, partly because I just don't want to deal with the psychopaths. Okay, so coming back to this idea of dualism and moral concern and their relationships, well, in fact, the other way around, if you deny the soul or you deny free will, there's a couple of nice papers that indicate that you get more antisocial behavior, you get more cheating, you have more unpleasantness to other people, right? This is two different papers, each of which had a number of different experiments. So this is very solid finding, right? And they use things like an excerpt from Crick's book telling people that they don't have a soul and their idea they have free will is an illusion, and that turns them a little bit antisocial. Now we are presenting this data as going in the other way, but I have to admit, of course, it's just a correlation, and so the direction or the question of a third factor is important. I think the heritability of callousness and the fact it's relevant to everyday life, whereas arguably apart from you guys, the relevance to everyday life of monism versus dualism is somewhat low, right? So for our sample, so I think it's more likely to be in that direction. But this is work in progress, and we're keeping on looking at things and whether there could be a factor of religious belief. The initial data suggests that that is a factor, but can't explain it all. Anyway, what might be going on? And now I've got to get to the brain, right? So what might be going on here that could explain how this could come about, that we could have this negative relationship in these things. Well, now there's an awful lot of research now that looks at how you engage in scientific, logical, numerical reasoning. This is actually from a meta-analysis we did in our lab. It's a little bit more formal than most of the other meta-analyses that have been published, but clearly what it indicates is there's a number of areas on the lateral surface which are in intraparietal sulcus and lateral frontal cortex, which are associated with this type of analytic thinking, right? You also see, you now see a very different set of areas, and they tend to be more on the medial surface of the brain, which are involved in social cognition, so in emotion and emotion regulation, in thinking about your own feelings, introspecting and thinking about who you are, and in a variety of social reasoning tasks that involve empathetic perspective taking, right? So we get a different set of reasons. So there's some evidence here that there's a conceptual divide. That is, that the mechanism supporting what I'd like to call empirical understanding, right, the evidence of the senses, are, and also higher order empirical understanding, like understanding of physics and mechanical reasoning, that they're then in very different regions to the regions that support the concepts we use to understand other minds, at least in the sorts of social interactions that are presented by scientists in the scanner. Of course, autism also suggests some distinction between these types of understanding. So this wouldn't seem to account for what's going on in the explanatory gap, where there's some sort of disjoint. What might be a better analogy for the explanatory gap is something like this duck-rabbit illusion, where you can either see the duck or you can see the rabbit, but you cannot see both at once, right? So you can either understand the feeling someone has, or you can understand how their mind is working, but to some extent there's some disjoint between the two. You can't quite bring them together. You see, if you focus on one, the other seems to fleet into the distance, and vice versa. Well, why might that be happening in the brain? Well, now there's a very big phenomena that has been talked about recently in the brain, which is often referred to as the default network. And what scientists have discovered, and they've been mainly focused when they do imaging tasks on what brain areas are active when you give someone a task, right, on the assumption that active areas are associated with the cognitive components of the task you give someone. But it's been noted there are a number of regions that tend to be deactivated when you give someone a task, as compared with when they're just left to think their own thoughts at rest. And that has come to be called the default network, and it's come to be a big puzzle and of great interest in neuroscience in the last decade. So 2001 was a paper that first described it. So we now know that there are actually two networks, often referred to as task positive and a default mode network. And the task positive network tends to be activated during most tasks that psychologists give, and the default network deactivated. Now, it turns out that those two networks, even if you leave someone at rest in the scanner, so they're just thinking their own thoughts, tend to be negatively or correlated. It's often referred to as anti-correlated networks. So there seems to be a push-pull relationship between these. And over time, we are constantly switching between these two networks. You are constantly switching between these two networks. A task will push you more into one network or into another, but even when a task pushes you, there is residual fluctuation between these networks, right? So this is a constant process that's going on in your brain all the time. Now, like I said, this has been a big thing. It's really taken off. It's interest in this in neuroscience. But nonetheless, there's been a big problem about understanding what it really means. A unique challenge for understanding the functions of the brain's default network is that the system is most active in passive settings and during tasks that direct attention away from external stimuli. It's a recent review. So there's some question about what it does, but usually it's been framed and discussed as being a distinction between external and internal attention, between perception and introspection. And this doesn't quite work with my framework, so I did a study to see if I could show that that wasn't quite what it was. So what we did in this study was we gave people physics problems, right, and we showed them either as text or as a movie. The movies are taken from the Video Encyclopedia of Physics. And we gave them social stories or social movies. And these are really about, they involve both understanding people's intentional states, but also understanding how they're feeling, and in rather complex ways. So for instance, in the social movies, there's always a question about whether one person understood what the other person was feeling. And importantly, we had rest periods as well, so we could just compare this with a resting baseline. And there's a massive difference in what brain areas you recruit, but the main point I want to make isn't about the fact that there's a massive difference. It's to do with these brighter areas that you can see. And in these brighter areas, well, the pattern you see is that when you're doing the physics tasks in this physics region, you activate this area. When you're doing the social tasks, you deactivate it, right? And you see the same vice versa for the social areas. So you have these two sets of areas that are in this push-pull relationship. One is when you engage in one type of reasoning, you're turning the other one off. And that also fits perfectly with the anti-correlated areas. Okay, so there are some provisos to make. I need to kind of move on, right? But I think what this is suggesting is that there is a neural basis for why we think of the phenomenal and the physical as fundamentally disjoint, right? We're seeing a neural competition between these two. Okay, so now I run into a little bit of trouble with time, but I'm going to so I'll make some very brief remarks about. Now, in fact, you might wonder, is this relevant to moral decision making? And in fact, we know already that there is a push-pull between two sets of areas from the work of Joshua Green, and these areas correspond exactly with the areas that I've described. And so what it looks like is that when you're faced with a dilemma that requires you to harm another person, you're activating these regions, which are social regions, and they're putting the brakes on you being willing to do this action, even though it would be for the greater good. So I think that what these social areas are really doing is that they are contributing to a perception that other people have a soul. And we've done a number of different experiments to help us get a feel for that. We've looked at dehumanizing people, which of course when groups are dehumanized, is a very real social phenomena, then atrocities are committed against them. And we've also looked at the correlation with callous affect for whether you are willing to commit these, or whether you say you'd be willing to commit these harmful actions to other people. And again, we see a correlation with the callous affect scores, and we see these same brain regions implicated. So to conclude, Levine, who of course came up with the explanatory gap, tells us that the explanatory gap argument doesn't demonstrate a gap in nature, but a gap in our understanding of nature. Of course, a plausible explanation for there being a gap in our understanding of nature is that there is a genuine gap in nature. But so long as we have countervailing reasons for doubting the latter, we have to look elsewhere for an explanation of the former. And what I want to suggest to you is that examining our neurocognitive structure for an explanation of the gap both fits a scientific worldview and actually looks like a very productive research agenda, which is giving us lots of good behavioral and brain imaging data. So here's a little depiction of the explanatory gap, and the common thought is it lies out there. It lies out in the world, and the common strategy is to try and find a bridge between these two types of between these two aspects of nature, rather, I should say, is the common view. I want to suggest that it's an illusion to imagine we can find this bridge. What we need to understand is that the explanatory gap is actually inside us, and it's a problem that occurs when we try to think about cognition, right? Because when we're trying to think about cognition, we're doing something essentially unnatural. We're using a scientific worldview, which we use to manipulate objects in order to understand persons, which we naturally use a completely different network to understand and to guide our interactions with them. So really, rather than think of Rodin's marvelous thinker, who you might imagine would be able to integrate his different types of thinking, I think we have to have a slightly more desultory view of the capacities of our mind. We are unfortunately hampered by our cognitive architecture, and in particular by a very powerful distinction in our brains between the mechanisms for understanding minds and our mechanisms for understanding machines. Thank you.
Okay, a little bit of time for questions. Tobias?
Very brief. Why did you leave out the functional stance? And second, what is the difference of your view to McGinn's view?
So what was the first question?
Why did you leave out the functional stance? I thought that was doing all the work and then it's theory, but you didn't mention it.
Yeah.
All these functionalists.
Okay, because I'm really interested in the phenomenal and the physical, I guess. Let me answer the other question about Colin McGinn. Right, so Colin McGinn's view is that there is something about our cognitive architecture which prevents us from understanding what the bridge is. Right, so he's still got the bridge out there in the world, right, and the cognitive architecture is a limitation. I'm saying more that the appearance that there is this unbridgeable gap is coming from our cognitive architecture. So does that make sense? Yeah, a little bit, right. I would actually say that my own view is that the phenomenal consciousness, free will, and souls do exist, right? And in fact, you know, if you don't think they exist, I don't want to play with you because you're probably not very nice. But so, I mean, I absolutely believe there are moral truths and that people genuinely have experiences, right? I just don't think the tools of science can be applied directly to them. Now, I think there's a lot of crossplay between science and between understanding someone's phenomenal states and between science and understanding what's the right thing to do is. Certainly they can inform each other a great deal, but my view is that in order to inform each other profitably, you first have to understand that those ways of understanding the world are based in fundamentally different conceptual schemes. And so we need to be very careful to separate out where our evidence is coming from.
Thanks. I'm inclined to think of the explanatory gap in the case of mind and body, let's say, as one of a member of a family of gaps which are sort of metaphysical in nature, like, for example, the gap between moral facts and natural facts, or the gap between facts of physical necessitation, causation, and chance, and let's say facts about patterns of properties, instantiation across the world, for example, and many others. And so when you put forward the idea that the mind-body explanatory gap is a sort of, can be thought of as reflecting a certain architecture of our minds, it seems that doesn't have any application for these broader sort of metaphysical gaps. So I'm just wondering...
Well, to moral facts, it's exactly, I mean, we're trying to collapse it
exactly.
into that problem.
Okay, now maybe that's interesting in the case of moral facts, but these other, you know, there are all sorts of, let's say, the gap between the world of physical necessitation, laws, and chance, and the world of, let's say, patterns of property instantiation in a 4D world. I mean, these are things that you've got these people having these endless debates about these.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just wondering if you could have a broader picture, let's say, about the architecture of mind that might.
You know, I said that I had this research agenda, and I'm just, I mean, I think I'm already being, I think some of my less favorable reviewers say I'm grandiose. So, you know, the idea is that philosophical paradoxes in general reflect something to reflect features of our cognition rather than actually reflecting reality. But I'm taking this one problem at a time, okay? I mean, you know, but yes, I think most paradoxes will eventually resolve into, I think if you want to do good philosophy, go to the scanner, right?
So it's very nice for these two networks, but I wanted to issue some skepticism about applying it to the explanatory gap. And one way to put forward the skepticism is by drawing on the analogy of the duck rabbit. The duck rabbit. So in the duck rabbit case, you can sort of keep one profile in mind or in focus at a time. So they suppress one another to a certain extent. But they don't completely suppress one another. One can sort of remember the other one when one focuses on the second one and vice versa. And so one can sort of keep them, one can compare them in a way, and one doesn't have any problem seeing that they're one and the same, even if one can just focus on one at a time. So it could be just the same with this mind and the brain. You can sort of activate one or the other. It doesn't seem to be a general reason to believe that when you have these processes that anti-correlate, that it should be hard to see that they are one and the same, as illustrated by the...
I mean, I do think that they're one and the same. I mean, I am a physicalist in this sense, right? So, I mean, the position I hold is very similar to how you say it. That is, I mean, it is well shown that you really can't entertain both perceptions in their full detail at once, right? And I think that's the explanatory gap. That's where the analogy works. I also think the analogy works for what you're saying, that you can, if you come at it with the right type of understanding, you can understand that they are one and the same. But I think for your average person, right, with the naive person who hasn't been tutored in this view of why they might have this impression that persons and mechanisms aren't identical, they're just going to go to dualism. It's a more immediate way to interpret, right, this strange bifurcation in the perception. Does that make sense?
Well, many people who are very tutored retain this sense of distinctness. Many physicalists keep feeling that there is an explanatory gap, and I don't know if that's explained then, given that there is no general reason to suppose that these...
Yeah, so I'm a physicalist. When
processes suppress one another, that they seem distinct.
But I'm a physicalist, and I think there's an explanatory gap. This is not a position that's usually... And I don't think that any scientific thing will close a gap. But it's not an unusual position, but I don't think it's inconsistent.
It's not unusual, isn't it? This is a very common position isn't it the most common position among physicalists? Hold there a distinct, a conceptual gap, but no ontological gap. And they hold that the... okay, I just said I'm not sure it's so unusual. It seems to me it's a version of the most popular position among physicalists these days. It holds there is a conceptual and an explanatory gap, but it's wholly epistemological and not ontological.
Oh, well, in fact, I think, unlike the phenomenal concepts type work. Sorry, I shouldn't have said physical. I think most scientists don't hold.
I see.
But, yeah, okay.
I think of Thomas Nagel as having pioneered this in his
absolutely.
74 article. He has his footnote saying maybe we just have two fundamentally different concepts.
Yeah, and which Christopher Hill then went, yes, no, I see. The position is very similar to that. But it's not a very big part of the field right now, that position. I mean...
Maybe it depends where you're coming from, but yeah.
Right.
Last one?
Just a quick question to maybe direct future research. No question about what you've discovered. There may be a complexity or a higher level, I don't know how to say it better, but you talk about this applying to the average or the naive person. My question to you would be this: investigate whether you would rather be employed by or imprisoned by a determinist who had empathy than a moralist who was just a strong moralist.
We're doing that research, so thank you. Yeah, so we're doing research where we see how people's moral judgments change as a factor of both their level of empathy and their belief in the soul. And you can flip the correlations in some cases, right? So you can have one correlation to do an action, and then you tell them there isn't a soul, and you flip it. So, but that's all work in progress. But yes, thank you. I think that's very interesting.
Thank you.